Welcome. I'm Father Mitch Pacwa, and welcome to EWTN Live, where we bring you guests from all over the world. And our guest tonight is the Vice President for Communications for the Knights of Columbus. He is trying to communicate the story of faith, leadership, and service of the Knights. He's doing it through a very informative and interesting new book that he co-wrote with Maureen Walther called The Knights of Columbus, an Illustrated History. So please welcome our guest, Mr. Andrew Walther, who is joining us via Skype tonight all the way from Connecticut. And this is our way of keeping at least a 6-foot difference between us. So, welcome, Andrew. How are you?
Good to be here with you, Father. I'm very well. How are you?
I'm doing well. First of all, I want something cleared up. Is Mary Walther any kind of kinfolk to you?
Well, I actually co-authored this book with my wife, Maureen, and we had quite a time doing it.
Oh, good. That's nice. You got to do that with your wife. And you know, first of all, a number of our viewers may not even know what the Knights of Columbus are. And it's obviously not a cooking school for pancake breakfast. There's something much more profound to it than that. What is the organization known as the Knights of Columbus?
Well, the Knights of Columbus is almost 140 years old. And it began in New Haven, Connecticut in 1882. It was designed to be an organization that would strengthen the faith of Catholic men, and it would do this in a variety of different ways. First, it would help keep the men strengthened in their faith by bringing them together within a setting that was explicitly Catholic. Second, it would provide specific benefits to these men, which would make the idea of going to other societies at the time that were anti-Catholic much less attractive. And it would help them to keep their families together in the event of the loss of a breadwinner. So if a man died in 1882, his wife and children could easily be split up and sent to county or state institutions or to relatives that were not Catholic. And this had a profound effect on their faith in terms of being very caustic to it in many cases.
Sure.
So this was designed to also keep the families together and to help keep them Catholic in the event that a breadwinner lost his life or was unable to continue to work. The third thing that it was designed to do was really to help men be good citizens as Catholics. It was explicitly Catholic and it was explicitly American. And the idea was it was going to very clearly make the case that a Catholic person in the United States was a good citizen and should well be entitled to all of the rights that any other American should be entitled to. So again, the idea of second-class citizenship for Catholics is something we don't think so much about today maybe, but in 1882 in Connecticut, where Catholics had only been able to own land or build churches or vote for a few decades, this was quite an important statement to be making.
A lot of Americans don't know that the states each many of the states, not all of them, but many of the states each had an official religion. And it not only gave certain privileges to the state religion, but it also took away the rights of the other religions in some cases. So, for instance, I believe in Georgia and the Carolinas, Catholics could not run for office. And this was reluctantly granted in other states. And, of course, it wasn't only Catholics. In your state of Connecticut, Baptists also did not have the same rights as the Congregationalists, which was the official state religion. So those were some of the background situations in which large numbers of Catholics began coming to the United States in the 1800s.
That's right. So in the early 1800s especially,
Yes.
it was very rough for Catholics in New England, throughout the United States, but certainly in New England. Connecticut was particularly hostile, as I mentioned. Catholics couldn't vote, Catholics couldn't own land. St. Mary's Parish, where Father McGivney founded the Knights, was built a year or two after the state finally allowed Catholics to build churches. And even then, the New York Times opined that this Roman edifice had blighted an aristocratic avenue. So there were certainly some headwinds for Catholics, and Father McGivney took that head on. He named the organization after Columbus, which was an explicit statement that Catholics had been in this country since the beginning, had been in this area since the beginning, were foundational to the American experience. And he chose Columbus also because Columbus was the one person in the American history books at the time, the one founding figure of American history who was Catholic and was lauded in the 19th century. And so he wanted to make sure that this was very well understood. And he also picked some very interesting men to be with him in this endeavor. One of the men, the first president of the organization that became the Knights of Columbus, was a man named Cornelius Driscoll, who ended up becoming the first immigrant mayor of New Haven. The first Supreme Knight was a member of the Board of Aldermen, was on the Fire and Police Commission. The town constable was one of the founders and became the Supreme Secretary, the town coroner, et cetera, et cetera. He had this really very high-level group of guys around him to found the Knights of Columbus. He was choosing men who were pillars of their community at a time when it was hard for a Catholic to be a pillar of the community. He was picking men that knew how to win elections in anti-Catholic New England. In other words, men that could lead other men.
Yeah, that cannot be underestimated. In the southern states, the Ku Klux Klan was not only against African Americans having their rights to vote, but they were also very anti-Semitic and they were very anti-Catholic. And they spread to many of the northern states. The largest clans were in northern states, not in the South. And so this anti-Catholicism got organized in a variety of different ways, not only in a state like Connecticut that had barely allowed Catholics to vote or own land, but over the next 50, 60 years, up until World War II, Catholics remained suspect in the eyes of many people as citizens. And this was a difficult thing, as, for instance, when Al Smith ran for president in 1929.
Well, that's absolutely true. So you had, when the Knights of Columbus began, you had just come out of a period where you had a know-nothing governor in Connecticut, and the know-nothings were virulently anti-Catholic, xenophobic, etc. You rapidly transitioned in, by 1920, the Ku Klux Klan had really taken off, had really become a force to be reckoned with, and had millions of members. And the Knights became a major protagonist of the Catholic position and an antagonist of the Klan position. So, for example, when the Klan in the state of Oregon in the 1920s figured out that they could try to ban Catholic education in that state, it was the Knights of Columbus who funded the appeal all the way to the Supreme Court, defeated the Klan law in the Supreme Court case of Pierce versus Society of Sisters, and helped to save Catholic education in the United States in that process. And over again, the Knights took these stands against the Klan with the persecution of Catholics in Mexico, with even with our membership from the earliest days. I mean, I was reading an article last night from 1890, the eulogy for Father McGivney, and they were talking about how for the Knights of Columbus, color didn't matter. And this becomes a recurring theme in the early years. In the 19th century, the Knights of Columbus was already admitting African-American members. This was a constant and continual refrain that We wanted good Catholic men regardless of race, regardless of color. We were bringing together Catholics from all walks of life into this organization. In World War I, the Knights of Columbus were the only organization that ran facilities for the military that allowed African Americans. We didn't draw the color line and had facilities that served African Americans as well as Anglo troops. And we have pictures of both groups together in the same facility. And we were written up, in fact, by the historian who wrote the Black History of World War I as unique in this regard. In the 1920s, we had W.E.B. Du Bois write a book called The Gift of Black Folk, because African Americans had been excluded from American history books in the same way that Catholics had been, that Jews had been, and that German Americans had been. And so we tried to rectify that by, in the case of Catholics, funding a chair of American history at Catholic University of America. In the case of Germans, African Americans, and Jews, we commissioned books in the 1920s to bring those stories to life so that people could see the contributions of each of these groups to the American experience and to American history.
That cannot be underestimated. And, you know, I think those of us my age, more so than some of the younger folks, can well remember what a huge difference it made for African Americans when they got the right to vote, to work, to live wherever they wanted. And there was this flourishing of African American talent that came into so many realms of business, academics, sports, entertainment. I mean, across the board, African Americans showed this talent that had been suppressed by bigotry. Well, the Knights of Columbus were doing the same kind of thing at an earlier stage for Catholics, to let this talent come to the foreground that had been that had tried to stifle in the decades of the 19th century.
Well, that's absolutely true. In fact, in the 19th century, the Knights of Columbus began and were very vocal in terms of wanting to defend and stand up for the rights of Catholics as early as the late 19th century. We were speaking out against policies of the U.S. government that were anti-Catholic in Cuba and in the Philippines. Very quickly, in the 19-teens, we established a commission on religious prejudice, and that commission was enormously successful. In just a few years, they managed to shut down more than 9 in 10 of the anti-Catholic publications that had sprung up around the country. And this was done in a variety of ways. We sent men out to talk to the folks that were publishing these things and explain to them what the Catholic position really was. So there was some real ecumenical outreach. We also worked with the Justice Department at times when things, crossed into the realm of slander and libel. And at the end of this time, there were only a handful of these publications left. Then World War I began, and the Knights pivoted to serving all of our troops under the banner, everybody welcome, everything free. But at the same time, we were the official organization that provided for Catholic servicemen. And that meant that we provided chaplains, we provided mass, we provided religious materials, but anyone else could show up at these, what we called them huts. Anyone could show up, any troop could show up, his uniform was his ticket in, and there was no forcing of the faith on them. They were there for a cup of coffee or a donut or to write a letter home or whatever it was. And yet this was a profound witness for a lot of these soldiers who had never met a Catholic before. There were areas of the country that just didn't have many, if any, Catholics. And so for many of these soldiers, the first experience they had of a Catholic was a Knight of Columbus giving them some food or a drink or some reading material or paper to write a letter home for free.
Yep. And a lot of folks don't relate to that experience, but having lived in the South for half of my life, I've been to a number of areas where I was the very first Catholic that even elderly people in certain communities in East Tennessee had ever met. They'd never seen a Catholic that they knew of, and I was the first one that they ever talked to. And At least the Knights made a good impression. I did the best I could, but you have to make a good impression on people, and the Knights have done that. Something else that I don't think a lot of people realize is that the Knights of Columbus had a very significant role in citizenship by actually influencing the way the Pledge of Allegiance was said. Do you have material on that as well?
No, absolutely, and that's covered in the book, certainly. One of the things that the Knights of Columbus did in the 1950s was to promote the concept of adding the words "under God" to the Pledge of Allegiance. And the idea here
So it's one nation under God and indivisible. That right. Phrase, "under God," this was pushed by the Knights of Columbus.
Previously, it had been one nation, indivisible. And we pushed to add the words "under God," and we were successful in doing so. And the idea was to really show the difference between the American system of government, our constitutional system, which, going back to the Declaration of Independence, very clearly bases all of our rights not on the state, but on the Creator. And so it was a way of showing, of juxtaposing the American system, of which the Knights of Columbus were very proud, with the Soviet system, in which everything came from the state. And so this was a recurring theme for the Knights. The idea that these rights come from God was something that we embraced very early and something that we repeated very often.
And it wasn't only the Constitution of the Soviet Union. It was also the National Socialists, Workers' Party, the Nazis. It was also the government of France and a number of other nationalistic governments that saw the state as the source of rights. And
that's absolutely true.
Our Constitution, or excuse me, our Declaration of Independence, and subsequently the Constitution built on that declaration, recognizes that rights come directly to each individual from the Creator, that is God.
No, that's absolutely true. And the Knights of Columbus were very clear very early that in terms of taking a stand against Nazism, in terms of speaking out for the Jews who were being persecuted by Hitler in the 1930s, as early as 1937, we were speaking out for them, and bringing the importance of God into all of this. As the war wound down, the Knights of Columbus were strong advocates of the fact that you couldn't have a lasting peace if you excluded God from the calculus. We had running battles in the United States with the Daily Worker, which was a communist publication. They were no friends of ours. And we sent lecturers around to talk about these issues. And, you know, you always had people on one side or the other. And one of these lecturers was famously attacked when he was speaking out against communism. And someone said, well, you must be a fascist. And his response was, just because I don't like Russian caviar doesn't mean I like Italian spaghetti.
And it's, you know, this sense of having this basic principle that we share with the founders of the country, namely that God is the source of the rights of each individual, and He bestows them on each individual, not on the government, but on people. And that we share that as Catholics with the founders of the nation, but we also, and this is something I think is very important about the Knights, they were well instructed by great popes like Pope Pius XI, who also wrote strong condemnation of communism in an encyclical, and a equally strong condemnation of National Socialism, the Nazi Party, in his encyclical Mit brennender Sorge. You know, you're simply following Catholic teaching, and in so doing, demonstrating the very basis of good American citizenship.
And that was explicit with the Knights of Columbus from the earliest, and the two encyclicals that you're mentioning, they were actually published. They're in the book. They were published a week apart during Holy Week, one on Palm Sunday and one on Good Friday of Holy Week. And the Pope really went after both of these ideologies as being deficient, and for the reasons that he set forth, that they were predominantly atheistic, that they in the case of National Socialism certainly racist as well, and it was very clear to Catholics reading what the Pope had written, precisely where he was coming from, where the Church was coming from on this. And the Knights of Columbus were very proud to be supportive during World War II, as in World War I, of the United States and its efforts in fighting. In World War II, certainly one of our Supreme Knights actually went over to Britain in the middle of the Blitz, with bombs falling all around him, just to shore up the troops, to see what was going on over there, to take stock of what we were doing with the United Service Organizations, the USO, which we were on the founding board of, and to really have a sense of the patriotism that Americans and American Catholics were showing in this period. And so I think the embrace of that idea that our rights come from God, that all men are created equal. This is something you even see in Kennedy's inaugural address. Kennedy, of course, was a Knight of Columbus. In his inaugural address, he says, our rights come not from the generosity of the state, but from the hand of God. And this follows in the wake a few years after we had added the words under God to the Pledge of Allegiance. And so you see this thematically cropping up again and again in Knights of Columbus circles and in the Knights of Columbus literature from the period.
And by the way, what I think it was a U.S. congressional representative from Ohio, himself a Knight, who helped get this bill through Congress. His name was Rabot. Did he come up in your studies?
Absolutely. We get into that in some detail in terms of how this proceeded. The Knights of Columbus Fourth Degree took initiative with it. Then it was taken up by our Supreme Convention, ultimately signed into law by President Eisenhower, and so on and so forth. So we cover that in some detail because that continues to be a really important aspect of the understanding of America, the understanding that our rights come from God and not just from the state. And so the Knights of Columbus have been very proud to have put that into the Pledge of Allegiance, and very proud to have defended its place there in the years since.
One of the reasons I highlighted this is that Congressman Rabot's son became a Jesuit. And I lived with Father Durham Rabot when I was studying philosophy in 1970 to 72. He was at the University of Detroit when I was a student there. So it was, for me, also an experience of a very lively, very living history to have the son of the congressman who helped guide this into legislation, that to have one nation under God, as somebody, at least his son, that I got to know. So that was one of the reasons I very much like that story as well as the principle of it. Go ahead.
Well, this is one of the amazing things that we found in the book. Over and over again, you find a thread and you find someone who's done something, and it touches aspects of American life you wouldn't have imagined. And so I think as people go through the book and they look at the more than 500 photographs and they read the stories, they'll see a real fabric of America, a real story of American Catholicism, the ways in which it came of age, the ways in which it's had to contend with headwinds at various times in the past, in the present, and so on, in the ways in which it has, the Knights of Columbus and the laity have had a really profound impact on the American Church. And I think it's amazing when you find these stories, you find people that you didn't know were a Knight of Columbus, that were just, over the years, people had forgotten that this person was a member, whether it's Jim Thorpe, the famous athlete, or whether it's John Chang, who was one of the founders of the modern state of South Korea. And that was one of, I would say, the most enjoyable aspects of putting this together, was finding these incredible people who all shared this common bond as Knights of Columbus.
You know, something else too is that the story of the Knights of Columbus, starting in 1882, a time when large waves of Catholics were coming to America. There were lots and lots of Germans coming. They had been coming already because Otto von Bismarck, the Chancellor of the German Reich, had, persecuted the Catholics. But then lots of Catholics from southern Europe, Italy in particular, Eastern Europe, from Poland and Czechoslovakia and the other countries of East Europe. Lots and lots of Catholics came. They were extraordinarily poor, usually illiterate, and they make this transition precisely in this time period from being very poor, maybe working class, living in large urban ghettos for a good part of that period, to becoming the second best educated religious group in the country and the second wealthiest religious group in the country. Only the Jewish community is better educated and wealthier. This is a remarkable achievement, and the Knights are woven warp and woof into that whole history of tremendous development of the Catholic community.
Well, the Knights of Columbus were very interested in making sure that Catholics had, for lack of a better term, an important social network, and that we were taking care of both the faith of our men, but also really looking after the financial future, giving men the opportunity to provide for their families in the event of a crisis or death, making sure that the widows and orphans could continue to live their lives peaceably, looking after their well-being, maintaining their Catholicism, etc. And so for the Knights of Columbus, as the church came of age, Knight of Columbus Al Smith faced the Klan in the 1920s in his two presidential campaigns. And, Knight of Columbus John Kennedy faced the questions he faced as a Catholic in 1960. And so you see this development over time in the ways in which Catholics were looked at, discussed, talked about, understood, and the development of Catholics from really a small minority in the early 19th century to a fairly large group by the end of the 19th century, to the largest denomination in the country now. And you see the ways in which the Catholic faith has come under scrutiny in different times for different reasons. Different ideas of the faith, different tenets of the faith are scrutinized at different times. So the concerns of the 19th century are very different from the concerns of the 21st century. And yet you see the ways in which Catholics have had to navigate church and state in the United States and around the world. And I think for the Knights of Columbus, standing up for religious freedom, standing up for Catholic civil rights has been a consistent theme, whether that's in the Middle East today where persecution is quite rampant, or whether that is domestically, as we did, say in the 19-teens and 20s and even beyond, even quite recently. You see that both the international and the domestic aspect of a real respect for religious freedom, a real respect for human rights, and a real respect for the ideas that the country was founded on in terms of the equality of all people, in terms of the divine origin of human rights, and so on.
Yeah, and one of the things that we have to take a little break at this point, but something that I'd also like you to address is the role of not only the right to liberty, but to right to life. And, that comes from God. And we'll pick that up in just a few minutes to see what the Knights are continuing to do at the present time. So please stay with us. Okay, so we are continuing our discussion on the Knights of Columbus, and of course want to encourage any of you who are interested in the Knights of Columbus to go to their website, kofc.org, kofc.org, and you can find out a lot more about the Knights in general. You know, I myself am a Knight, fourth degree Knight, and one of the things that impressed me about the, going through the different degrees was the kind of preparation each of the men had to do in these two areas in terms of development of their faith, their understanding and commitment to their Catholic faith, and their understanding and commitment to their American citizenship. It's not just a few activities that occur in history, but it is very part, again, warp and woof of the training of knights, the formation of knights would be better than training. Their formation is in their Catholic faith so that that deepens and they're committed to it, and to their American citizenship and the principles of this nation. Would that be a fair assessment?
That's a very fair assessment. In fact, the Knights of Columbus, there are four major principles for the Knights of Columbus: charity, unity, fraternity, and patriotism. And patriotism is very important to that. So are charity, unity, and fraternity. Mm-hmm. And that unity aspect is very important because it's not only the Knights of Columbus united together with each other, but it's also the Knights of Columbus united with the church. And so one of the things that the degrees teach very early on is the importance of the Rosary, for example. Mm-hmm. And so you have every knight at his first degree ceremony traditionally has been given a rosary for many years. And this is to really highlight the importance of prayer. And the teaching of the Knights to have a spiritual sense is something that goes back to Father McGivney. You can see it in the prayer programs over the years. You can see it in the Marian hours of prayer that we continue to do, in the major prayer events that we've done in places like Phoenix and Los Angeles in the last decade or two. You see a real emphasis on prayer, on formation, on helping men to understand the faith better. We have a current program ongoing called Into the Breach, which is a video series that really helps men to understand their role, picking up on Bishop Olmsted's work. And so you see over the years, the Knights have developed and have devoted an enormous amount of time and effort to the spiritual formation, and at the same time have been a very strong patriotic organization that has, sold war bonds in the wars, has staffed what was a precursor to the United Service Organizations, the USO, was a founding member of the United Service Organizations, the USO, really has been there through thick and thin in terms of helping troops, helping veterans, helping the country, and all related back to that original principle. To be a good Catholic is also the formation you need to be a good citizen.
Yeah, I think that's extremely important, and we mentioned a lot earlier about the anti-Catholicism that had been in the country, but there were also a lot of questions. Catholicism had developed its shape on cultural level in various kingdoms. And we weren't accustomed to a democratic republic. This had not been part of Catholic history in many places. Little bit of a democratic republic approach, little bit in Poland, little bit in Switzerland, but not much. And it was very limited. To be Catholic in America, where you had a republic with democratically elected officials, took a change of mentality in a lot of ways for Catholics My own grandparents came to this country as members of large empires. My grandfather and grandmother were both under the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and on the other side of my family, they were under the Second Reich, the German Reich, under Bismarck and such. This was, and other relatives were from the Tsarist Russia. To come here, they also needed training in integrating their Catholic faith into a democratic republic. And that was an important role for the Knights.
Well, you know, in his foreword to the book, our Supreme Knight Carl Anderson talks about Alexis de Tocqueville's experience of Catholic Americans and the strength of their citizenship within this republic, of the importance of the role that they played, and of the confluence of their faith and their citizenship. And I would say in the case of the Knights of Columbus, this is certainly evident. One thing to keep in mind is that the early founders of the Knights of Columbus, the early members, certainly Father McGivney, the men around him that he brought together, and then the other men who helped build the organization in those early formative years, they all, with very few exceptions, were Irish. And they had an experience, whether themselves or their parents, of what it was like to live in an environment in which their religion was definitely second class or worse, where a persecution was often the order of the day. And so that really led them very quickly to embrace this idea of religious freedom. And as early as 1895, at one of the big banquets, one of the speakers gets up and says, you know, we demand basically our equal rights, and we are happy to give equal rights to everyone else as well. I mean, this is, you know, we don't think anyone should be discriminated against because of color or creed, but that includes Catholics.
Yeah, and this is something that is a great set of principles. But now we see ourselves at a new stage of history. The difficulties that people have with the Catholic faith are not so much in terms of our origins in Europe and from European cultures, or even our devotions to the Blessed Mother and the saints and the Eucharist. Such has been the case in earlier times. Now, the opposition has to do with our stance on the life issues, and that to be a good Catholic, one must stand up against abortion and against euthanasia and a lot of related things. Another issue certainly is human sex trafficking and pornography. These are values that are part of the present day culture. Some people have interpreted the freedom of speech to include pornography, and we're against that. And other people have seen the right to control your own body as a right to kill a child in your womb. And death with dignity, that they'll talk about mercy killing, but they associate killing the sick and the elderly as their form of mercy. The Knights have been very much at the forefront of these new concerns as well.
Well, you know, it's interesting. Over the years, I think the lines have shifted a bit. So when the Knights were born, the fault line for Catholics was really a Protestant majority that was, in many cases, skeptical of Catholics at best or hostile at worst. And over the years, and the Knights were a large part of this, as we mentioned, in the 19-teens, doing a lot of ecumenical outreach, the bridges were really built, and there was significant healing done between those communities. And I think the fault line shifted as time went on, and you're right to point to the life issue, to more of a tension between secular values on the one hand and religious values on the other hand, particularly we could say Christian values or Judeo-Christian values. But you see these tensions affecting Catholics and others of like mind. And so what I think has happened is the Knights were founded from the beginning to focus on promoting the teachings of the Church, for promoting the idea that Catholics could also be good citizens, for promoting the idea that we were going to roll up our sleeves and help those on the margins of society. And what's happened is the margins have changed a bit over the years. So widows and orphans from Irish or other Catholic immigrant families in the 19th century, late 19th century, were certainly a marginal group. Today, the margins include people like the intellectually disabled, people like those that are unborn, folks that are recent immigrants that need assistance in some way. Those margins have shifted profoundly. And so I think what the Knights of Columbus has done has been to maintain a consistent view that people who need help need help. It doesn't matter if they're incredibly small and unborn. It doesn't matter if they have intellectual disabilities. We're going to roll up our sleeves and help with the Special Olympics from day one and help with other programs for those folks from the very beginning. For the Knights of Columbus, the March for Life, the idea of a pro-life commitment, goes all the way back to the 1970s. When you read the things that Supreme Knight John McDevitt or Supreme Knight Virgil Decant said about abortion back in the 70s, or you read the things that Carl Anderson, the Supreme Knight today, has said more recently, you see this consistent concern for human life and human dignity, and that has not changed. The margins may have changed, but the Knights of Columbus commitment to those in need, those on the margins, and those who need our help, as well as to the teaching of the Church, has remained absolutely consistent.
I remember just a few years ago, and this to me captures the difference between the Knights with their Catholic worldview and then the secularized worldview, where we saw Iceland was boasting about the fact that there were no children born in Iceland who had Down syndrome. They had none. The reason they didn't have any is that by knowing before birth that they had Down syndrome, they would abort them. And so they have, as they say, freed their country from having children with Down syndrome. Whereas the Knights of Columbus celebrate the gift that people with Down syndrome are. And with Special Olympics and many, many other kind of activities that the Knights get into to deal with folks, as you said, who are mentally disabled or challenged, and serve them. And this is the stark contrast to me of, I think, a culture that is going to suffer tremendous loss because they don't have enrichment from the people with mental disabilities and being difficulties.
Well, the Knights of Columbus, as you mentioned, have been a strong supporter of Special Olympics from the very beginning with Eunice Shriver. We recently had a Special Olympics event at our fields in Rome. And, you know, those with physical disabilities, those with intellectual disabilities, they find themselves sometimes on the margins. And for the Knights, it's important to stand there with them. We brought a team of Haitian athletes who had suffered in the earthquake 10 years ago and had suffered amputations as a result of their injuries. We brought them not only to do exhibitions to train American soldiers who had suffered amputations in Iraq and Afghanistan, we also brought them to meet the Pope. And we helped give them jobs within Haiti. We helped them to create a prosthetic program that not only helped themselves, but helped other folks in Haiti who had suffered in a similar way. And we've done the same thing with wheelchairs around the world, giving wheelchairs to people who need mobility in Mexico and Afghanistan and Vietnam, all over the world, as well as here at home, of course. But what you see in all of this is a real sense of human dignity. You see the answer to the question, who is my neighbor? And all of these people for the Knights of Columbus, all of them are our neighbor. All of them deserve our help. And so we step up, we step into that breach, and we help them.
Yep. There's one other area of the role of the Knights that cannot be overlooked, namely the willingness of the Knights to help in national disasters around the world. We're certainly aware of them in the South, helping out with the flooding in Louisiana a few years ago, the hurricanes that hit us. This is a truly remarkable element of what the Knights of Columbus do as well. Why don't you address that gift as well?
Well, you're absolutely right. The Knights of Columbus have helped in disasters. I don't think many people remember the 1903 Kansas floods, but that was the first big disaster we worked on. People still do talk about the 1906 San Francisco earthquake and fire. The Knights of Columbus famously helped after that disaster, and it's gone right along ever since, domestically and internationally. After Hurricane Katrina, after Hurricane Rita, after Hurricane Sandy, after all of these disasters, the Knights have been there, and many others, rolling up their sleeves, helping people rebuild, helping people to get back on their feet. Typhoon Haiyan in the Philippines, the same thing, helping fishermen get new boats, helping plant coconut trees and other crops that had been wiped out. So the Knights of Columbus has a real focus on the charitable component, right? I mean, on the one hand, it's based on the idea of love of God, that's our faith, but it's also based on love of neighbor, and that's the other half of the Great Commandment. And so the Knights of Columbus tries to live both of those out, as well as helping in other areas, whether it's in Italy in the 1920s and beyond with poor children in Rome who needed a place to play, and who we helped in that regard by building playgrounds, or with the restoration of the patrimony of all Catholics, with the restoration of St. Peter's in so many ways, or St. Paul's outside the walls, really trying to bring the experience of Catholics in terms of love of God and love of neighbor to life through our members and through the actions that we undertake.
Yeah. The other thing that very much characterizes my experience of the Knights in these circumstances is there's such a good-natured, kind of easygoing attitude of a bunch of guys that are just going to hunker down and get this done, and they're going to have a kind of good time doing it as well. There are obviously some very dangerous situations that have existed, but they go into it with the cheery camaraderie of a bunch of guys who are using their skills from the regular everyday life and their masculine sometimes strength to push and shove things around to make sure they get back in order, as well as their intellects to help reorganize things. It's that kind of camaraderie that also strikes me as very characteristic of the stuff that I see Knights doing.
Well, this is something that you see, I think, in the book repeatedly.
Yeah.
The Knights of Columbus are constantly meeting the needs as they appear and as they crop up. And the needs are different in different times, and the needs are different in different places. Sure. But you have men that are united in purpose, that are united in faith, that are united in charity, that are united in love of country. And, as Christ told us, where two or three are gathered, there he is. And so on the one hand, you have the faith piece. On the other hand, you have the fact that where you get a group of men together, they can actually accomplish far more than a single man could have accomplished. And so I think you see both the spiritual and the practical aspect of unity at work in those kinds of examples that you mentioned. And our guys are very happy to do it, very proud to do it. And it's a way to live out their faith actively. It's a way for them to really fulfill the love of neighbor commandment in service to the love of God.
I would also then, we're coming to our last couple of minutes here, but something that I, as a priest, very much feel is that men in our culture are sometimes confused about what they should be doing in terms of changing understanding of male and female roles. There's also an absence of men from their families. Right now, the majority of people are not married to each other, and the majority of children are born to unmarried couples. And I would look to the nights to be a way to call men to that Catholic value of loving the sacrament of holy matrimony and loving their families, and that this is going to be another element of training men up in faith and patriotism to become fathers and husbands who love the people with commitment, their wives and their children. This would seem to be a good direction for us to keep moving towards.
Well, you know, and we mentioned this also in the book. Pope Francis a few years ago, and certainly his predecessors, have praised the Knights of Columbus for the witness to the Christian marriage, to Christian family, to the role that men should be playing as fathers within these families. And so you see over and over again the Knights of Columbus, as Father McGivney founded us to do, stepping up and helping to form men in a way that takes a Catholic man, and the idea is to make him an even better Catholic man. And you see this from the beginning. You see this in the early literature and the early speeches that the Knights were giving. You see the idea that this is an organization for Catholic men, but it's also an organization that's designed to help men step it up, take it up a notch. And that's what our current Into the Breach program is about. It's really about helping men to discover even more about their faith, more about themselves, more about what they can do, more about the way that they fit in the spiritual sense, and the ways in which they can take action based on their faith and grow in their faith at the same time. And so I think this combination of faith in action, this combination of faith and works, is a hallmark of the Knights of Columbus, and it extends also to family life. The idea that you should be a good citizen, you should also be a good father. And of course, the Knights were founded to help protect Catholic families, to keep Catholic families together in the event of a catastrophe confronting a breadwinner. And so that focus on Catholic families, so praised by Pope Francis, as I said in his letter to us in 2013, remains very important to the Knights of Columbus.
Well, thank you very, very much for being with us. This is great information, and your illustrated history of the Knights of Columbus will be a great source. We appreciate that, and hope that you do real well with that.
Thank you very much, Father.
You're welcome. I also want to bring to you, there's a lot more going on in our nation right now with various closures and hunkering down and such. But EWTN will continue to bring you daily Mass and daily Rosary, Eucharistic adoration, the Divine Mercy Chaplet, and other devotionals and prayers throughout this pandemic crisis. And we are hearing a lot of gratitude from our viewers. I'm reading a lot of the emails. For instance, I'll read you a couple. There was one where a lady said, "Thank you so much. My husband and I love starting the day with the Rosary with Father Mitch, or the weekends from Lourdes, followed by the family prayer with Father Joseph." I just love those wonderful prayers. Mass. Thank you for the TV Mass from Irondale. God bless you all, and hope and pray that this virus goes away. That's Winnie from Canada, because this is very much an international thing that we're suffering through. Also, another email says, I thank God and Mother Angelica for this televised online and streaming Mass. It has always been such a precious treasure. Thank you all at EWTN for continuing Mother's mission to bring the gospel to all, to evangelize the world. I pray that through these very unfortunate circumstances, more people will be brought into the church by exposure to teachings offered by EWTN in this way, by His will. Lenten blessings from Susan in America. Also, we've heard from non-Catholics who, stuck in their apartments and houses, appreciate the peacefulness of the prayer. As we do this, and everybody is strained, we're strained, you're strained on so many levels, but we ask that you please remember us. You can go to EWTN.com/donate so that we can keep bringing you these programs. And may Almighty God bless you and keep you, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. God bless and thank you.